she comes. Here she comes.
Oi, como vai? Tudo bem? Welcome back to Lessons in Portuguese with Professor Jason. Now, I know it's been an extremely long time since I uploaded a video on Portuguese or Brazilian Portuguese, but hopefully this one makes up for the wait. What I want to do in this lesson is pretty ambitious, right? You might get bored, but we'll see. And that would be an overview of the verb system of Portuguese. Now, like I said, this is an ambitious, broad, complex topic, so before we begin, let me clarify a few things, okay? First off, this is meant to be more of a reference video, right? Something that you can come back to again and again and check as you learn new tenses. Because it's not realistic to expect to understand everything about verbs in Portuguese in one sitting. In fact, I'm not claiming to present everything. So remember, this is just an overview, but still there is a lot of information to process, all right? Second, since this is such a complex topic, the presentation will probably, most likely, definitely contain a few minor mistakes and typos and things like that. So please do go ahead and point those out or ask any questions that you might have. That's what the comments are for, all right, the comments section. Third, although most of what I say is in fact valid for continental or European Portuguese, the standard I applied was Brazilian usage, all right? Just keep that in mind. But be aware that there are some differences in terms of verb conjugations, tense usage between Brazil and Portugal, and I don't really address those in too much detail here, but they're minor. Fourth, one thing that I've done to try to simplify this lesson, to limit its scope a bit, is to only use regular forms when possible. So we do have a few irregular forms of the verb ter, which you can't avoid, and a couple irregular past participles like aberto, okay? So keep in mind that many frequently used verbs in Portuguese are in fact, or do in fact have many irregular forms. All right, finally, almost done with this first part. Finally, since many of these slides contain a lot of text, a lot of information, they're a little bit busy, it might be kind of difficult to see them once I've shrunken them down for the video. So what I did was I went ahead and uploaded the entire presentation to a website called slideshare.net, where you can see them full size if you'd like. All right, so here is that URL for the presentation on slideshare.net. Okay, let's go ahead and get started with this overview of the verb system in Portuguese. All right, there is a lot of material to get through, so I've organized it this way. First, we're going to talk about the subject pronouns. That should be just a review. Then I'll move on to talk a little bit about the basics of verb conjugation. What are conjugated verbs? How do we conjugate in general? And then the main portion I'll talk about will be the actual tenses themselves. I'm going to present about 19 tenses. There are more, believe it or not, more possible combinations. We're going to talk about the verb stems and endings for each, and I'll give examples of usage in each case with some English equivalents, so you can sort of see how each tense would be used. Okay, now this table here on this slide presents the subject pronouns, the personal subject pronouns that are going to determine the endings of the verbs we use. You can see that they're divided into first, second, and third person, singular, and plural. All right, I'm assuming this is review for most people. One thing to point out is that o señor, these forms, o señor, o señores, a señora, as señoras, are the formal or polite forms. Okay. A couple other observations you can see in blue. The pronoun vos, second person plural, is rarely ever used in ordinary speech or even in writing these days. Vocês is used instead. Now, tu, for you, singular, is very common throughout Portugal, somewhat common in Brazil, but much less common. Okay, it's only used in certain regions. The forms that corresponding to those polite forms, o señor, as señoras, okay, those correspond to the forms for the less polite forms, você and vocês, okay, as you can see from the examples. All right, let's talk a little bit about conjugation in general, okay? Now, an unconjugated form is the form you would find in a dictionary, right? If I look up to speak, to eat, to open, I'm going to find these unconjugated forms called infinitives, all right? Conjugated verbs are the forms that have been modified, have the endings added on to reflect who's performing the action and what tense we're talking about. Now, for most tenses, the way we conjugate is to add an ending corresponding to the different subjects and tenses or time frames to stems of the verbs. And all that depends or varies depending on the tense, the verb class, and the subject we're talking about. Now, when I say verb class, I'm referring to the fact that in Portuguese, as in Spanish, we have three different classes or types of verbs, right? There's verbs ending in AR, and I've given some examples here. Verbs ending in ER, the second conjugation, and verbs ending in IR, also called the third conjugation. I've called them verb classes here just to avoid any confusion. Now, this is important to know because different verb classes, right, AR, ER, IR, have different endings in the various tenses, right, in some of the tenses, a good portion of them. All right, step by step, how do we conjugate? The first thing we do is to determine the stem used for each tense. Now, stem formation can vary depending on the tense, right? It's not the same stem for every tense. For the present tense, preterite and imperfect, for example, the final two letters are removed from the infinitive, as you can see here. However, with some tenses, the infinitive itself is used as the stem. For example, we'll see this. This is the case with the future and the conditional. Still, other tenses take their stems from other tenses. For example, the imperfect subjunctive and the future subjunctive use the preterite to derive the stem, right? So you will see in each of the cases where I present a verb tense that I have put the tense or the stem and the endings in different colors so that you can easily tell where the stem, what the stem is and what the ending is, okay? All right, now the second step, the second thing we do to conjugate is that we add the tense and subject specific endings to the stems, as you can see on this slide, right? So we have AR endings, ER endings, and IR endings for each tense, and those are added to the stem. Then we have our conjugated form. Now, a good thing is that in Brazilian Portuguese, we only need to remember 4 endings for each tense and verb class, and that's because, first of all, the pronoun vós is not used, so we can eliminate that line on our chart. Você can always substitute for to, no matter where you are in Brazil. And the endings for você, or the formal form, o senhor, a senhora, and ele, ela, third person forms are identical. You can see from the chart, those all have the same endings. The same is true of the plurals, right? Vocês, os senhores, as senhoras, and eles, elas. Those endings are identical for each tense and verb class. So, long story short, you only have to remember 4 endings in Brazil. Okay, now what we're seeing on this slide is a verb tense chart, right? Sort of a chart that presents many, not all, but many of the different verb tenses and combinations of tenses that are possible in Portuguese or in Brazilian Portuguese. Okay, notice the different columns and rows that we have set up. Of course, you can have the indicative or the subjunctive mood, right? Verb tenses can be simple, meaning that the conjugated form is a single word, simple tenses. They can be classified as perfect or compound tenses. The compound tenses really include perfect and progressive tenses, and that means the conjugated form is comprised of 2 words. In the perfect tenses, which we'll see later, we're taking the verb ter and adding the past participle. To form progressive tenses, that involves the verb estar and the present participle. Okay, so that's sort of the matrix of verb tenses. Now take a moment, maybe pause, and read what some of these asterisks mean. Okay. Okay, now we're going to start with our different verb tenses. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each tense because the information is on the slide pretty much. But here we have the present tense. Now the present tense is used to say what people usually do, what they're doing now, and sometimes even to talk about the immediate future. You can see that there are examples at the bottom of each slide, right? And I've given you the endings for the AR, ER, and IR verbs. The endings are in the lighter green color, And the stem on each of these slides is going to be in the very dark green that might even look sort of black on your screens. So this is the present tense. Okay, moving on to the preterite or simple past tense. The preterite is used to narrate or to tell a completed action or event in the past, to tell what someone did or what happened, what occurred in the past. The imperfect is also a past tense, but this tense is used to talk about recurring or ongoing actions in the past. You can see from the examples. To describe people's emotional states in the past, or to talk about persons, things, and conditions in the past, usually in a descriptive type of mode, right? When we're talking about actions using the imperfect, we're talking about recurring or ongoing actions, what we used to do, what we would always do, okay? All right, here we have the future tense. Now the future in Portuguese is used much as the future in English to talk about what people will do, right? But notice the observation here in blue. It's more common to talk about future actions using the ir, to go, plus verb construction. In other words, to say that someone is going to do something. Vou trabalhar would be I'm going to work. That's a very common way to talk about future actions in Portuguese. Okay, but you can also use this future tense. One thing to notice also about this tense is that the stem is the infinitive and the endings are the same for AR, ER, and IR verbs. With the conditional, which is used to talk about what people would do in certain situations, right, what they would do, the same is also true. We're using the infinitive as the stem, and the endings are the same for the AR, ER, and IR conjugations. Another thing to point out here is that the endings are the same as the endings for the ER and IR verbs in the imperfect tense. Okay, so the conditional, what people would do. That brings us to our first subjunctive tense. Now, this is the present subjunctive, and we don't have enough time, and we don't want to go into all of the uses or the explanation of when and why the subjunctive mood is used. But the subjunctive, having said that, the subjunctive generally is used in constructions with two clauses when each has a different subject, right? So we have a main clause and a dependent clause. The meaning communicated by the verb in the main clause determines whether the second verb should be conjugated in the subjunctive, and that's true in both of these examples. So the form of the present subjunctive, and this is important, the stem always comes from the first person of the present indicative, removing the vowel O. Okay, so that's how we get the stem in all cases of the present subjunctive. And then you add the endings in light green here. Now, Portuguese also has a past or imperfect subjunctive that you would use in the same types of situations I just described, but when the main clause verb is in a past tense, often the imperfect. Now notice the stem here. The formation of the stem is a little bit different and a little bit complicated. The stem comes from the third person plural of the preterite tense minus the last four letters. Okay? You can sort of get a sense of when to use this tense by looking at the examples here. All right. This slide presents the future subjunctive. Now this is a tense that Spanish lost a long time ago. So if you know Spanish and you're learning Portuguese, this might be a little bit different, the notion of a future subjunctive. It's used to refer to actions that may or may not come to pass at some moment in the future. So it typically comes after conjunctions like if, si, or when, quando, or after, depois que, or even until, até, when these refer to a specific instance in the future rather than what a person customarily does. Okay? The stem for the future subjunctive forms also comes from the third person plural of the preterite, or the eles form, right, minus the last four letters. Some people get confused and think that the forms for the future subjunctive are the same or identical to those of the personal infinitive, which, by the way, we're not covering. Okay, this is an advanced topic we're not covering in this lesson, but it's not true. Future subjunctive forms and the personal infinitive forms are not the same. Sometimes they do coincide, but remember, the personal infinitive uses the infinitive as its stem. The future subjunctive does not. It uses this rule that you can see in blue text here. Okay, it's to talk about what may or may not happen at some point in the future. Okay, now we're moving on to talking about the perfect tenses. It's a type of compound tense. In other words, the forms, the conjugations have two forms, two words, and a couple other observations about perfect tenses. The perfect tenses use the auxiliary verb ter, to have, plus the main verb in the past participle, usually an ado, ido form. Now, the tricky thing about this is that ter, to have, is in fact irregular in many tenses. Okay, so you need to look it up. And also, some verbs have irregular past participles. And the verb I just happened to choose for this slide, abrir, does have an irregular past participle. It doesn't end in ido, it's aberto. Okay? So, the present perfect, in Brazil, the usage of this tense differs slightly from its counterparts in English and Spanish. Instead of meaning that someone has done something before or already, like I have spoken Portuguese before, it usually means that someone has been doing something. In other words, it's an action that began in the past but continues in the future. Look at the example. Tenho falado bastante português. Tenho falado bastante português. I've been speaking a lot of Portuguese. All right, the next tense is the pluperfect. This tense is used when you want to say that someone had done something at a certain point in the past, usually or often before another past action occurred, as you can see pretty clearly from the first example. Somebody had done something by the time something else happened. Okay, what we're looking at now is the future perfect tense, meaning that we're going to take the auxiliary verb ter, conjugate that in the future tense for each subject position, and then add our past participle of the main verb. So this is the tense that we would use if we want to say that somebody will have done something or what they will have done by a certain point in the future. Okay, and I have a note on here just reminding us that the past participle of escrever is irregular, escrito. Okay, so for example, if you look at the example in the lower left-hand corner, by the time he needs my help, quando ele precisar da minha ajuda, I will have already left. Eu já terei partido. Or when we arrive, we will have walked. Nós teremos andado. Teremos andado. Okay? So what somebody will have done at a certain point in the future. All right. Similarly, we have the conditional perfect. The conditional perfect then takes the verb ter, conjugates for each subject position in the conditional, and it refers to what somebody would have done. What somebody would have done if certain circumstances were true. So, for example, if I had been in that situation, I would have waited longer. Eu teria esperado mais tempo. Or they would have been more successful. Eles teriam tido mais sucesso. They would have had more success. Teriam tido mais sucesso. So, conditional perfect describes what somebody would have done in certain situation. All right, now we're on to the present perfect subjunctive. Okay, I don't want to say too much about this tense. It is a complicated tense, but it is not that uncommon. It's fairly frequent to hear the present perfect subjunctive. It's the form we would use when a present tense main clause verb, if you look at the examples, those main clause or first clause verbs are in the present tense. When those verbs would trigger the subjunctive and they refer to something in the past, usually the recent past, that's presumed to have already taken place earlier. So look at the example. I hope, present, that he has already eaten, past. Espero que ele tenha comido já. Okay, so we're taking the verb ter, conjugating ter, and the present subjunctive for each subject position. Or, she doesn't believe that I have opened a checking account. Ela não acredita que eu tenha aberto uma conta corrente. Right? So the believing is happening now, or the not believing is happening in the present, but the opening of the account is presumed to have happened previously. So present perfect subjunctive. Now if you thought that was complicated, let me introduce you to the pluperfect subjunctive. We're taking the verb ter, our auxiliary verb, conjugating in the imperfect subjunctive, tivesse, tivesses, etc., and then adding our past participle. Okay, we're going to use this form, the pluperfect subjunctive, when a past tense, when the verb in our main clause is in the past tense, triggers a subjunctive, and refers to something that is even further, 1 degree further back in the past. So look at the example again. I doubted that their team had won. Now, the winning or losing is happening before the doubting, but they're both in the past. Eu dudava que seu time tivesse ganhado. Other example. She did not believe that we had opened a restaurant. The opening or not of the restaurant is in the past before her not believing, but they're both in the past. Ela não acreditava que tivéssemos aberto restaurante. Ela não acreditava que tivéssemos aberto restaurante. She did not believe that we had opened a restaurant. So by this time, our tenses are getting fairly complex. Okay, we're going to move on now to the second type of compound tense, and those are the progressive tenses. Okay, with the perfect tenses, we were using the verb ter, to have, as the auxiliary verb. With progressive tenses, right, we use the auxiliary verb estar, then we add the present participles, which usually end in ando, endo, indo. Okay, now in Portugal, I have this note in green, they don't use those ando, endo, indo forms, they use instead the infinitive after the particle a. Now keep in mind that estar, which is used always with these progressive tenses, is irregular in many of its tenses. Okay, so we have the present progressive on this slide, which simply means that we're going to take the verb estar, conjugate for each subject position in the present tense. So we come up with estou, estás, está, estamos, estão. Okay, and then we add the present participles of the main verb that we want to talk about. Andando, escrevendo, partindo. Okay, so in Brazil, we'd have examples like these. Eles estão comendo, or ela está partindo. She's leaving right now. Because we use this tense to talk about what's happening right now at this moment. However, remember, in Portugal, they would probably say these this way. Eles estão a comer, or ela está a partir, which also means she's leaving right now, they're eating right now in Portugal. Okay, here we have the preterite progressive, the preterite progressive. This tense is used less commonly. It's used to refer to something that somebody was doing at some point in the past, but usually only when that period is being treated as a distinct moment with a beginning, middle, and an end, emphasis on the end. Look at the examples. Quanto tempo estiveste esperando? How long were you waiting? Again, it's implied that the waiting ended. So that was a completed action. That's why we're using the preterite. Or the second example. Ele esteve me mentindo durante 2 anos. Ele esteve me mentindo durante 2 anos. He was lying to me for 2 years. So this tense is not that frequent, and to use it, you have to be referring to something that was going on for a specific period of time that had an ending. Now, here we have the imperfect progressive. Okay, this is similar to the previous slide, but its usage is much more frequent. It's used to refer to what someone was doing in the past, okay, what somebody was doing in the past, but the context may be understood as less specific or more open-ended, sort of like a background action that might have been interrupted at some point. Okay, so we're taking the verb estar, and instead of conjugating in the preterite, like on the previous slide, we're conjugating in the imperfect. Estava, estavas, estava, estávamos, estavam. Okay, and then adding our present participle forms. So look at the examples. Tu não estavas falando com ela. Tu não estavas falando com ela. You weren't talking to her. Or estávamos comendo quando você ligou. We were eating. We were in the act of eating when you called. So this is very similar to the usage of this same tense in English. In fact, all the progressive tenses are. Okay? And we also have a future, and you can probably guess coming up, a conditional, a future progressive, which simply means we take the auxiliary verb estar, conjugate in the future for each of the subject positions. Estarei, estarás, estará, estaremos, estarão. Okay, and then add our present participle forms. Okay, and this is just used to say what somebody will be doing. It's used to say what somebody will be doing, usually at a specific point in the future, in the not so distant future most times. Now, this tense should not be used as a substitute for the simple present, or the simple future tense, I should say. So in other words, if what you want to say is, I will call tomorrow, then you just simply say, ligarei amanhã, ou vou ligar amanhã. You don't say, estarei ligando amanhã. Okay? But there are some legitimate uses. Look at these examples. Estaremos ganhando mais dinheiro na semana que vem. We will be earning more money next week. Or 3 hours from now, we'll be drinking beer and watching the game. Daqui a 3 horas, estaremos bebendo cerveja e assistindo ao jogo. So if you're really referring to something that's a specific time in the future and you want to say what you will be doing at that time, it's okay to use the future progressive. Okay? Just don't use it as a substitute for what you will do. Use it when you want to say what you will be doing. All right? Finally, the last tense that I'm going to cover in this presentation, I know it feels like it's gone on forever, right? is the conditional progressive. So we're taking the verb estar, our auxiliary verb, conjugating in the conditional, estaría, estarías, etc., and then adding the present participle, right? Ando, indo, indo. Now, this is the tense that we use to say what somebody would be doing if certain conditions were true. Now, often, the simple conditional will work just as well. Look at the examples. If I had, or if I were to have internet access, I would be, or I'd be, writing an email. Se eu tivesse acesso à internet, estaria escrevendo email. Estaria escrevendo. Or if they had work, they would not be leaving. Não estariam partindo. So that's the conditional progressive to express what somebody would be doing. Okay? Okay, well that concludes this very long overview of the verb system of Portuguese. Hope you're still with me, and I hope you found it to be helpful and informative. As always, I do welcome your questions, comments, suggestions, etc. So please take a minute, leave a comment, let me know what you thought about this video lesson, okay? Now, if you want to learn more Portuguese, be sure to take a look at my other videos. You can also visit my website, professorjason.com. It's mostly Spanish content, but I will be uploading some Portuguese as well. And be sure to join my Facebook community at facebook.com/ProfessorJason. And that's going to have lots of content, lots of updates in Spanish and Portuguese, and some good discussion going on too. And you can also follow me on Twitter. Thanks a lot for watching. This has been Professor Jason, your guide to Brazilian Portuguese. Thanks a lot. Até logo. Ciao.
Da, 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 da.